All right, well, we can begin again for our second speaker, if we may. We'll do payback for our third speaker if he doesn't. In getting a chance to prepare the introductions, as I said before, it's kind of fun to sort of look and surf around a little bit and see what you find. But in this case, it was particularly easy because I sort of basically owned this book already, which I was sort of interested in and relied upon, because at one point I was trying to sort of search for computational psychology, not computational neuroscience, because you can find tons of things for computational neuroscience, but what can you find for sort of people sort of applying sort of a principled, broad-based approach to sort of psychological topics? And sort of surprisingly, you don't find as much as you think you might. You know, if you go back to Rescorla Wagner, it's sort of, that's behaviorism, but sort of psychology has given that up to sort of machine learning and reinforcement learning sorts of people. And there are lots of mathematical models in psychology, but they're not so much computational, and you have people who do sort of little integrated problems. They'll pick a model of memory, or they'll, you know, do a neural network that does this, but you don't have as much of a sort of a diverse sort of from low level to high level sorts of things. But one of the things you do come across is the computational explorations in cognitive neuroscience that our next speaker co-wrote with, I don't know if it was your wife at the time.
Yep.
It's now your wife?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Didn't break us up, so that's
okay, good. A labor of love. And so it is, I think, a nice example of how you can go from sort of first principles, low-level concepts, and build yourself all the way up to something that deals with things like memory, you know, can have a chapter on attention, neglect, categorization, sorting, high-level concepts. And it's not just sort of embedded in sort of abstractions or symbolic logic, but it actually can tether you down to neurons and bring you all the way back up. So our next speaker did begin his career undergraduate at Harvard, and went on to do his graduate work at Carnegie Mellon, and he did his postdoctoral work, at least part of it, at MIT, and then he has been a very consistent member of the University of Colorado Boulder community ever since. I also learned through recent conversations that, just as I was saying before, he's another one who sort of recognized his obligation to bring sort of high-level experience and perspective to helping new psychologists learn introductory material, and you're going to be teaching introduction to psychology soon. And so along with all the other sort of you know, publications and things that demonstrate his science, he's had, you know, first single-authored review in Science on networks and papers in PNAS and so forth. But it also shows sort of his being a good sort of, I think, sort of citizen of our discipline, and that now you don't have to buy his book because he's gone to all the work of sort of updating it for sort of the current versions of the simulators and compilers and things, and now it's available as a wiki book. So I really liked this book. I felt it was worth my hard-earned money, but now you can sort of have access to a lot of the same material just by going to the website and learning about Emergent and its application in these. So I'd like to thank Dr. O'Reilly for coming to speak to us today, and I hope you'll give Dr. O'Reilly a welcome here.
Well, thanks for that great introduction, and really excited to be here. So today I'm going to talk to you about goal-driven cognition, and this is kind of a new direction for me in my lab, and so we'll see what you guys think about that. So, you know, I think it's a good segue from Liz's talk here to talk about what I'm going to focus on today with the history of these kind of Pavlovian and you know, Skinnerian paradigms really being very much current in the dominant kind of paradigm in research, as you saw a lot in Liz's talk. And you know, this new data, well, not new anymore, but you know, kind of very influential data from dopamine cells in the ventral tegmental area, showing exactly that in the appetitive paradigm, as opposed to the fear conditioning paradigm that Liz was talking about, you get, you know, classic kind of you know, behavioristic Pavlovian responding to the conditioned stimulus, and when you train up a CS, the dopamine no longer responds to the actual US. If you omit the US after presenting a conditioned stimulus, you get a dip as if there was an expectation that you were going to get a reward based on that conditioned stimulus coming in. So you see in the brain, the exact kind of predictions of these very, core old models of how learning works. So in some ways, behaviorism is really not only kind of alive, but really dominant in the field. And some of you might be surprised to know that. So the basic paradigm is that you're either rewarded or punished, and behavior changes according to that feedback. And the real question is, is that accurate? Are we the sum of our reward history, or is there something else? So what do we think might be missing from that picture? Anybody have any ideas? Be brave. What's missing? Yeah? Language. Okay, good. I like that. Not sure how that changes things, but there's something to that.
Free will.
Free will! All right. Okay, now we're getting there. Yeah? Okay, so you could have a higher level thing. It's somewhat what Liz talked about, where you have the low level mechanisms, but you also have this kind of cognitive knowledge. Maybe that plays into the language thing. Yeah? Oh, you read my title. But I'm going to surprise you. I'm not going to say goals right away. Any other ideas? Well, let's go to it. Here's my take on it. Tantrums. That's what's missing. And if any of you are parents, or if you have an unbelievable memory of your childhood, you know that one of the dominant phenomena of early learning that is really, quite striking, are these tantrums, right? And I have yet to see a computational model that explains where tantrums come from and why do we have tantrums, right? And yet they're really, 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 really evident, and they seem really important. And I think, if you think about it, the energetics of a tantrum don't work out according to behavioristic theories. And it's interesting that a lot of people try to interpret tantrums as a kind of, hey, they're trying to manipulate me into doing something, these kids, it's a stimulus response reward kind of strategy. I don't think that's what's going on with tantrums at all, right? And again, the energetics just don't work out. They get mad and burn a lot of calories for a very long period of time for often very little reward. It's just not a good strategy, okay? So, but I think those tantrums are a window onto something, right? And it's a window, again, onto the fact that as people, we care about stuff, okay? And that's what's really missing from the behaviorist paradigm, is that people aren't just this kind of passive recipients of, stimulus and response. We're agentic. We have things that we want in the world. We have goals, okay? And that's really what kids are wrestling with when they develop this ability to have tantrums. It doesn't start right away. You get a little bit of a honeymoon period there. But that period, starting at age 2 or so, is when kids are really starting to formulate intentionality, these goals, these desires, and getting frustrated when things aren't going well. And so that's what I really want to focus on today, is really thinking about what are the dynamics of that kind of goal-driven, intentional level behavior as it contrasts to the kind of behavioristic paradigm. And as I said, this is kind of a new direction for us. So this is what passes for data in this talk. My wife nicely noted when she saw this talk recently, there's no data in this talk. But here's your data, okay? And we are going to start doing actual experiments soon. But I think everybody relates to these things to the extent that you'll agree that these are real. Okay, so how many people have found it somewhat difficult to start writing a paper or other kinds of difficult activities, packing for a trip, paying the bills? Anybody? Okay, but you notice that once you get started, it's not so bad. Okay, and I think this is the kind of key thing we're going to start to focus in on. this is just a little graphic illustrating that, you would think that you would procrastinate and do irrelevant things when you have free time, right? But in fact, what really happens is you procrastinate in direct proportion to how much other stuff you should be actually doing. So why is that? Why are we so irrational? And everybody struggles with this, like, why do I procrastinate? I know it's not rational, okay? So one of the things I want to get out, explain in this talk is why are we behaving so irrationally here in this procrastination? Okay, so then the other side of this is, you've started doing something, how many times do you find yourself doing something that really isn't something you should be doing, okay? So on the one hand, it's hard to do the things you should do, and on the other hand, it's really hard to stop doing things that you shouldn't be doing. So for example, playing the mindless video games. I'm sure everybody with a smartphone now has gotten sucked into that trap at least once or twice. I personally have a really difficult time with my kids' Legos. I just can't stop organizing them. And we have these little drawers, and I sort them, and I know that this is totally stupid because they're going to make a big mess of these things in a couple days. But I just find it so satisfying. And you see a lot of people on the airplane playing solitaire. Anybody? What is it? It's sorting cards. Who cares? It's even bits of cards, Why do you do that? Why can't you stop doing it? People have actually died playing video games. It's sad but true. This level of obsession is really crazy. Okay, so here's another one that a lot of professors will relate to for sure. Sometimes when you look at your email inbox, you just get this incredible feeling of dread. And it's just, overwhelming. And then other times, that exact same inbox, I feel like, hey, no problem. I got this. And so what is it? What's the difference there? Why can we take the same stimulus and feel so differently about it? Here's a higher level kind of meta level issue in the field. Why do we have all these kind of strong confirmation biases that everybody knows is wrong, but everybody does in pursuing their scientific hypotheses? You go out and you try to confirm what you think is true. You don't do this Popperian kind of falsification stuff that everybody sort of thinks they should be doing and everybody gives lip service to, but you never actually do it. Why is it that we can't stop ourselves from being such a confirmation bias focus? So you guys may have some sense that there's something that's connecting all these different phenomena together, but here's my take on it to really kind of crystallize what's going on here. And this is the core hypothesis, that we have two phases of mental life. We have a goal selection phase, which involves a careful weighing of the costs and benefits of whatever it is you think you might want to do. Okay? And the kind of computational level description, which I'll show you later in our model, involves a kind of multiple constraint satisfaction process that's taking into account the context, the affordances, the things that are possible, how much risk, how much effort, all these other kind of negative sides of things, drives, how hungry am I, how thirsty am I, all these factors get weighed together to kind of figure out what you want to do next. Okay? And this is kind of a prime directive here, that you need to have an active goal representation. And if you don't have one, and we'll talk about this a little more later, you feel bad. And there's kind of a built-in meta-level emotional affective signals that tell you, figure out something to do. And then once you figured out something to do, you switch into this goal-engaged mode. And the difference between goal selection and goal-engaged is, once you have an active goal, that comes to dominate your quote-unquote value function, the thing that determines what kinds of rewards you're going to experience as you do stuff. And so selected goals, once you pass this very stringent test of activating a goal, they tend to be robustly held. They're hard to give up. And the value function is dominated by a continuous evaluation of the proximity to that goal. You just care about how much closer are you getting to your goal. And this is directly driving those dopamine bursts and dips that we talked about at the start as a function of changes in your kind of perceived proximity to the goal. And costs in this context are very much downplayed, okay? But nevertheless, the system is learning about those costs, but really everything is dominated about by this goal-driven activation. And so this dichotomy between these two modes or phases of mental life can then explain a lot of those paradoxical kinds of phenomena that I talked about. So if we go through and play this out, you'll kind of see where this all fits in. So why is it so hard to start something? The whole point here is that the goal selection process is when you are at your most rational. This is when you're kind of really weighing in the most objective kind of Bayesian sense of the word, what am I going to get? What's it going to cost me? How much effort is there? Is there something else I could do that would give me, more reward for less effort? Okay? And the reason why the system is so careful during this goal selection phase is that, essentially once the goal gets engaged, this goal engaged phase takes over and everything becomes dominated by that. So you better be careful and pick a worthy goal at this point because you know that it's going to kind of take over your cognition after that. And that's what we see in these other examples here. Once you've got a goal engaged, that incremental progress towards the goal becomes everything. And it's actually becoming a popular trend these days, the gamification of life, right? So everything is being set up, taking the cues from video games about how to motivate people to kind of keep doing stuff that they may not otherwise want to do. And really, it's all about giving people incremental signs of progress towards their goals. Okay? And if you do an exercise bike or something like that, you know how important it is to see your little progress. And if you're making progress and you can see you're making progress, you get those little incremental rewards. And video games are absolutely the perfect optimized example, and that's why we have such a difficult time. But also simple things like sorting cards or sorting Legos give you that sort of incremental, gradual little bits of progress that keep you really engaged. And again, the costs are very much downplayed, and people can experience extreme hunger, extreme need to go to the bathroom, doing all these other things, just ignoring all the kind of obvious negative signals, enduring pain, etc., once you get that goal engaged. And so here's a nice cartoon to illustrate this. This is, I don't know who this is, Zeus or somebody saying, Sisyphus, you are charged to push a stone up a hill only to see it fall down over and over again. And Sisyphus, of course, says, no. But then he says, okay, addendum. Each time the rock rolls back down, a meaningless counter will say that you've increased by 1 level. And that makes all the difference in the world, right? And that's really the sad truth of life. Okay. The example of the inbox, I think, can be explained as well. If you're looking at your inbox and trying to figure out what it is you need to do next, you experience extreme kind of overwhelmedness because there's so many different options. All of them have high cost, and none of them seem like they're going to give a high reward. And how are you possibly going to pick amongst these things, right? And again, going back to the procrastination, when faced with those kinds of difficult choices, if you can think of another alternative, like sorting the Legos, that might be shorter in duration and give more immediate rewards more reliably, maybe you'll do that. Maybe you'll just, I'll just play a quick game of Angry Birds or something, and then I'll get some inspiration to do all that stuff I need to do to write those reviews, etc. Or the recommendation letters, I don't know. Recommendation letters are the worst. Seems like all I do these days, right? So I think that's the difference, is that, you know, if you've picked something already, if you have a goal engaged, you've decided that you're actually going to tackle one of these things in your inbox, then you feel like, yes, I am totally making progress. I can do this. So that's the difference. And of course, you know, as a strategy tip, figuring out ways to get started on things that seem really low effort. Okay, so like if you're writing a paper, just write the title of the paper. Okay, make that your goal. If you make your goals really simple and easy, then you get started and you get that kind of goal engagement started, right? And so this is a really, you know, kind of classic tip in motivational psychology of breaking down big problems into small, easy steps and starting on those small, easy steps. And I think that's exactly what's going to feed into these kind of goal-driven systems. And then as to the larger issues in the field about confirmation bias, this is you know, explained in terms of basically once we've got a hypothesis engaged, it becomes essentially a goal, and we are driven to see that goal through. It's really hard and disappointing to give up on a engaged goal, okay? And you want to get that incremental progress towards it. So it's basically just a core part of our psychology that we are essentially exhibiting confirmation bias all the time whenever we have an engaged goal. And that's why you have people do all these very, very silly things that seem like, how could somebody possibly be so short-sighted as to think that, you know, we were talking about this at dinner last night, why would people make up data? If you're a scientist, you know that's not going to work. Talk about a replicability crisis, right? You make it up, right? How do you possibly think that's going to work? But yet you want to have this goal. You want to succeed. And that dominates the costs, and it makes you irrational. And so if you could stay in this aversive goal selection mode for long enough to be rational, you know, you would probably make better choices, but it would be very uncomfortable. And there's this really interesting thing we'll come back to in a little bit about how depressed people are actually more rational. People have heard about this. There's some data about this. And one possible suggestive idea here is that, in fact, if you are depressed, you're actually unable to engage a goal. That's part of what it means to be depressed, is an inability to get that goal engaged. And it makes you kind of stay in this goal selection mode, which is very rational. And so maybe we should have depressed people, you know, on IRB boards or sitting there looking at our research and telling us what to do, so that we could all be more rational and less kind of manic about our engaged goals. That would be a good strategy for the field. So going back to the tantrums, I like to think about this in terms of the Monsters Incorporated movie kind of capturing that power. There's something about the kind of extreme energy involved and kind of nuclear level core, you know, third rail, whatever kind of metaphor you want, about what goes on when a kid has a tantrum that says this is really the core thing that's going on in the brain. This is not some ancillary kind of thing. People need to have those goals engaged. And, you know, if you have a kid who's going through this period, you know, I can tell you that it's really good to just provide them with something else positive to do, okay? And in that context, I don't think you should feel ashamed to hand your kid the iPhone and say, here. Do some meaningless math problems or whatever, you know, kill some things. And then, you know, that gives them a feeling of control, resolves that uncertainty about the goal selection, and can do an amazing job of restoring function. Okay, so I think that's a kind of high-level summary of motivating this idea that the brain is built around these kind of two modes of behavior, goal selection versus goal engagement. And now what I want to do is kind of take that idea and apply it to the computational models that we've been developing over the years, based on a lot of the brain areas that Liz was talking about, to understand how these kind of brainstem systems and up into the ventral medial prefrontal cortex operate in the context of this kind of framework. And then I'll show you at the end an integrated computational model that shows all this kind of dynamics of goal selection versus goal engagement kind of taking place in a simplified case. So we've been developing over the years a model called Pavlov, obviously in the behaviorist Pavlovian tradition there. It's based on the idea that there's two dissociated systems for primary value versus learned value. And so in the context of this new kind of goal-driven framework, we can kind of reconceptualize what's happening in this kind of Pavlov model in terms of this incremental progress towards a engaged goal state. And so, so this is the idea, the overall framework. Your goal is to get food. You look out there in the world and you see stimuli that give you some indication of how likely it is that you're going to achieve your goal, right? And so if you're hungry, you want to get food, and you see a McDonald's sign, but it's like 4 blocks down the road, you're pretty far away from your goal. But as you keep driving forward or walking or whatever, you get closer and closer to that goal. And as you get closer and closer, you get incremental little bursts of dopamine marking your progress towards the goal. And in our computational model, we reconceptualize this learned value component of the Pavlov model as basically stimulus-driven indicators of progress toward a primary value, which is the end state that you're seeking for that goal. Okay? And so it's a nice way of kind of actually taking the math that we already had and kind of showing how that math applies in this kind of more foraging-based context, which is a much more natural paradigm, I think, than the standard CS-US conditioned stimulus paradigm. And so just to reinforce that a little bit, the standard paradigm, basically, you have no progress towards your goal. You get a CS as a square wave coming in, and you get all of your dopamine burst in one big burst, okay? Because the stimulus is either there or it's, not there, and then it's there. And that's essentially a very artificial version of what we think is a more natural situation where you have multiple sensory stimuli that indicate your overall convergence or progress towards the goal. And that you're likely to get, and this is the dopamine case, you're going to get, the video game case, you're going to get these incremental progress towards the goal. And then when you're satisfied, you've satisfied your goal representation. We think of that as now the primary value. And that's what drives the learning of the stimuli that are associated with that primary value. And the main point of this whole framework is to say that there are different brain systems involved in those two different components. And that actually gets back to the notion that really the goal-engaged versus the goal selection process are really two different parts of the brain operating in two different modes. So now I'm going to go through a little bit of the underlying biology. These are the main areas here. We have the amygdala, of course, down here that Liz was talking about, nucleus accumbens coming up into the dorsal striatum. Going back into the lower areas, you have ventral tegmental area where the dopamine neurons are. Lateral hypothalamus is kind of the lowest area in this hierarchy of brain systems, where you get primary recognition of those primary value. Like if you have sugar water or something, or liquid if you're thirsty, neurons in the lateral hypothalamus light up and drive dopamine signals directly. Going up higher, you have these kind of medial and ventral prefrontal areas that, again, Liz was talking about in this case, orbital, but also ventromedial frontal cortex. And so there's really a lot of different parts of the brain that are all interacting in this kind of limbic system. And what we're going to try to do here is understand different computational roles for each of these components in the overall network. And given the time constraints, I'm not going to be able to do this full justice. But here's a classic box and arrow diagram with labels that that may or may not capture your interest. So this is the lateral hypothalamus again in the bottom of the whole system, where you have these kind of primary value representations. And I should say, what I'm telling you right now is all on the appetitive side. So we have a plus sign after this PV, because this is like positive outcomes. We also have a negative side of those things coded by different brainstem nuclei that also overlay on top of this whole system. I'll tell you about that in a little bit. There's this area called the PPTG, which is kind of right next to the dopamine areas, and it seems to play an important role providing this temporal differences. So I actually forgot to mention back on this slide that the key operation here is essentially a temporal derivative of the learned value signal over time. So you take the value that you had at t-1, compare it with the value that you have now. If that derivative is positive, you give yourself a dopamine burst. And that's really the core operation. And we think that the circuitry involving the PPTG through the VTA, there's direct projections and indirect projections through the central nucleus of the amygdala that subserve that. And people in the fear conditioning world think of the central nucleus of the amygdala as a kind of subservient system to the basolateral amygdala. But in fact, there's direct projections of sensory information into the CEM. And these guys are actually, if you do experiments, you can lesion the BLA and get perfectly intact Pavlovian conditioning to CSs through the central nucleus of the amygdala in the appetitive case. And so this is really your kind of lowest level of the system with the LV kind of learned value representation in the central amygdala, the primary value in the lateral hypothalamus, and both of those kind of driving appropriate dopamine signaling. And so with that system as the kind of core evolutionarily ancient system, you have this kind of very basic distinction between LV and PV, goal engaged versus goal selection. And then on top of that, you have kind of slightly higher level systems in the basolateral amygdala and the ventral striatum, which means the nucleus accumbens mostly. And these provide descending projections that anticipate dopamine signals and kind of can shunt or block those signals. And that's really responsible for blocking the dopamine response that would otherwise occur when you get a positive reward. And so, the basic point here is that the computational mechanisms can be mapped onto very detailed biological data. There's a lot of new literature focusing on the lateral habenula as the pathway which the ventral striatum goes in and signals kind of dips or those kind of disappointments if the primary value does not emerge. And these things all kind of map onto the computational model in a satisfying way. So that's the high-level story you should be taking from this. This is what happens when you now add negative outcomes like fear responses, shock, et cetera. The peribrachial nucleus down there kind of plays an equivalent role to the lateral hypothalamus. Lateral hypothalamus also has negative outcome signals. The RMTG seems to play a complementary role to the PPTG. And again, the lateral habenula is one of the key nuclei in this whole circuit, driving these negative outcome responses. So, the bottom line is that a lot of these brain areas are known. There's a lot of detailed research going on, and it's really compatible with the kind of overall framework of distinguishing between the primary values and the learned values. Now I want to go up a little bit and talk about higher level processing areas. And it's kind of the classic idea in evolution that, it's kind of like a house that's been renovated many times. You build on the existing stuff and kind of get some weird, funky things going on because there's already an existing set of circuits. The higher levels of the system kind of tap into those existing parts of the circuitry and tend to modulate them or turn them on or turn them off in various interesting ways. And so that's what we think is going on as we go up to the orbital frontal cortex and these areas. And the key thing that we introduce at this level is the ability to actively maintain this goal representations over time. And so if you think about like a rat or lower level animals, a cockroach or something, they can have little tiny goals operating for very short durations. Whereas what characterizes people, at the extreme, is we can maintain these goal representations for a really long time. And the classic example we like to think about in my lab is like, why would anybody go to grad school? right? That's a really long duration, sometimes quite long, goal representation that seems to work against all odds in some ways. And how do you maintain that goal representation over such a long duration? What are the factors that reinforce it? It's a real challenge problem to really explain why people go to grad school. If we can figure that out, we've solved a really hard problem. Here's a kind of taxonomy of, oh yeah.
Sorry, to interrupt you.
Yep.
When you say actively maintain,
yeah.
in the model context, does that mean that these areas are chronically active?
This is a really important question that I would love to know the answer to that. So I feel subjectively like they are chronically active, but I would love to see the relevant data, but would be hard to come by. If we can get monkeys to have longer-term goals, but that thing, like you wake up in the morning and you kind of know, and I feel like I have, my dreams are different when I have an engaged goal. It feels like those damn things are still firing and dominating my cognition, even when they shouldn't be or something.
In your attempts to model,
yeah, chronically active, active maintenance kind of neurons. But I agree that it seems kind of implausible. Obviously, you can have some weight changes in there, but to the extent you have some synaptic plasticity or weight changes, you end up having kind of carryover problems, inability to get rid of those goals when they're satisfied. There's nice things about the active maintenance, but it does seem like how long can you actually maintain those things? So yeah, that's a really interesting question. But just to kind of flesh out what we're talking about here, one thing that's really important to clarify is that a goal is not a homunculus. It's not a single little tiny part of the brain. It's a distributed representation that encompasses multiple interacting brain areas, especially when we talk about these OFC and anterior cingulate cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And this is just kind of a way of kind of categorizing all the features of a particular kind of goal representation. So, simple, basic survival level goals. This is a kind of category of survival level goals. Have an affective state of hunger or thirst or fear or lust or whatever, and have a primary goal outcome that's kind of driving what a positive outcome in response to this kind of negative state. There's particular stimuli that can activate these things or reinforce them. Your progress that you're measuring or monitoring towards achieving those goals, the actions that get encompassed, and all of those things have to be connected together in a goal representation. And there's an ongoing kind of question exactly how that interconnecting of the kind of PV values, the LV values, the kind of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex action plan representations, these brainstem kind of affective states, how all that stuff gets glued together. But we'll talk a little bit about some of what we know about that. Yep.
Little technical question.
Yep.
How different is this from the concept that, for instance, the game theorists would have for utility?
Right. Well, utility is core here. That you have. Yeah, you have a weighing of cost and benefit. Absolutely. And that.
Just
yeah.
another vocabulary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Totally. That's the common denominator for when you for weighing the costs and benefits in selecting a goal. And I think economists would be happy with people's behavior during goal selection, and that's kind of what economists are describing as the rational economic human. There's some Latin phrase for that, but then once the goal's engaged, all chaos starts, and economists don't really describe that very well. So I think that would be an interesting challenge to say, well, here's why the economic models don't work. There's a lot of stuff that Liz talked about in the social domain. I think one of the answers to grad school, surprisingly enough, that we've come up with is that it's actually cool to be a grad student. What do you guys think? It's a surprising kind of, different kind of cool, but it's not one that everybody agrees with, but some people are into weird stuff, and it's cool to be into weird stuff, right? So that's part of it. And I think as scientists, we often really discount, especially cognitive scientists, we really discount the very, very strong influence. And again, to pick up on what Liz was saying, the best way to get people stressed out is to tell them to stand in front of people and talk about something. Those social kind of dynamics are incredibly powerful. And so a lot of what we do, I think, can be explained in terms of socially motivated and driven goal states. And that's just a small sample of some of those. And then, you know, what's also really interesting is that a lot of the core emotional states that we can describe are really tied up with the goal processing itself, okay? So when you achieve your goal, you experience satisfaction and happiness. And, you know, if there's one thing that people agree on, the best thing in life is to be happy, right? And so, you know, this is really all about, I think, in this framework, goal achievement. And people who are, quote unquote, self-actualized or have achieved some of their goals experience that kind of serenity or happiness. And you know, I think you could learn a lot from that. Abandoning a goal is very difficult, and we, you know, experience that as disappointment, but also sadness. And you know, that's a really deep connection, I think, there, that the goals really are important for understanding depression and sadness. Goal impediments drive frustration. If somebody's blocking your progress towards the goal, you feel frustration. That's your tantrum. Okay, their anger is your direction of some positive way of blocking a barrier to your goal progress. Okay, you know, and the angry old man kind of syndrome you can think of as just somebody who's basically chronically frustrated in their achievement of their goals. Goal inactivation, inability to activate these goals, then we can think of as boredom and also depression. So that's just a kind of, you know, there's a lot of these different taxonomies you can find out there, but I think, you know, it does help kind of concretize some of what we're talking about here. And I don't want to make any specific claims about those things. That's just an illustration of that. So I want to talk a little bit about this kind of map of goal representations, taking some of those general taxonomic kinds of ideas and seeing how they map out into the brain. And this is building on a framework I published a couple years ago about kind of the dorsal pathway versus the ventral pathway, the classic idea that Mel Goodale came up with about the kind of dorsal being a perception for action, kind of how pathway, and the ventral pathway being a kind of perception for identification, really applies to the prefrontal cortex. And in particular, you know, DLPFC is all about action plans, whereas VLPFC, ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, is all about kind of active memory representations for thinking about things in the world, semantics, language, you know, objects, stuff like that, all this kind of ventral pathway stuff. And what's interesting is you can take this same dorsal ventral axis and project it onto the medial surface. So this is a very impoverished slice, coronal slice through this kind of prefrontal cortex surface here, showing the medial surface as compared to the lateral surface. And the idea is that the lateral surface is where you do all your kind of cold calculation of plans and actions and stimuli. But the medial surface is where your goals live. And we talk about these as hot. Some people have said this is not intuitive, but to me, hot and cold is intuitive. I don't know. Hot is what you care about, and cold is like what you're thinking about abstractly and stuff. So that's that distinction. And so if we take that medial surface now and we kind of unfold it and flatten it out so we can kind of map it out, here's the dorsal medial frontal cortex. And actually, on top here, you can talk about essentially dorsolateral being the very more dorsal aspect of this. And underneath that, you have the anterior cingulate cortex, which is essentially the medial portion of the dorsal aspect of frontal cortex. Shading down into here, and Liz talked about area 25, which is kind of the subgenual ACC. And this maps very well onto her data. And then as you go out now onto the lateral surface, coming out into the orbital frontal cortex, and then all the way out to ventrolateral PFC. Hopefully you can see how that splaying out of this works. you can trace the connections between these frontal areas and these low-level brainstem nuclei and understand kind of the map of goal representations using those subcortical connections. And this is stuff that Unger and Price in particular have done. And this is really just a kind of fancier map of the somewhat hard to read graphs that they presented. So the idea here is that you have a primary area associated with negative outcomes, and that's really the subgenual ACC, associated with negative outcome states. Right next to it, on the medial OFC surface, you have a positive outcome, positive primary value representation area. And so this is, of course, your basic core distinction, negative, positive. And then outside that, you get kind of more stimulus-specific maps of the value representations associated with different stimuli. And this is where we think the learned value, the LV component of the system, lives in the orbital frontal cortex at that highest level of the system. And so these are going to be the sensory-driven value representations for visual, olfactory, et cetera. And then those shade out into the purely kind of cold visual representations out there. Going back up to the dorsal surface, you have value representations for the actions that you're considering. Okay, so when you're feeling dread about packing or writing your paper, you're getting kind of effort representations up here in this dorsal ACC areas associated with action plans, and thinking about basically the kind of, here's the description of the plan at an abstract level, and here's the value associated with that plan. How much is it going to cost me? How much effort is it going to take? How difficult is it? How uncertain is it? And when you talk about the uncertainty, that's a way to plug into all the kind of conflict literature that's often talked about in ACC. And according to this framework, conflict is just one of many different aspects of kind of negative value associated with action plans. And John Cohen, for example, and Matt Botvinnik have now updated their theoretical framework to be very consistent with this overall mapping. So it's really nice, though, but you have basically this whole network that gets bound to the lower level kind of grounded brainstem areas for these different value representations. And the basic model here is that constraint satisfaction processing, basically interconnected neural signaling taking place amongst all these areas, is what allows you to weigh the costs and benefits for whatever goal you're thinking about selecting. And that's what I'm going to show you in the computational model, is how that kind of dynamic takes place to weigh all those different factors and come up with the kind of best choice at the current moment. And then once that's engaged, as I said before, you lock in those representations that kind of win the competition, and then those end up providing top-down, strong, kind of active biasing signals to drive the dopamine pathway to really care about that stuff that you've selected as your current active goal. And that's the kind of overall sketch of the computational framework. Just a quick couple of points here about some details about this. So there's some really interesting literature suggesting that your active dominant goal is represented in your left hemisphere, and your right hemisphere is kind of evaluating possible alternative goal representations and kind of second guessing. Okay, this would make sense in terms of left dominance, generally speaking. And there's some really nice data, from, for example, the stop signal task, where that seems to really tap into right ventrolateral areas that may be monitoring for an alternative task, the stop signal that's low frequency, doesn't happen all the time. A lot of these kinds of things that have that kind of low frequency alternative task status seem to live in the right hemisphere. And then there's a nice study by Keklin's group showing that when you're kind of switching between different tasks, the dominant task, the current task, seems to be activated in the left hemisphere, and then the kind of other task that you're not currently doing is in right hemisphere, and you're kind of juggling between those. So it's an interesting way of thinking about the lateralization, and it's consistent with other stuff, for example, you know, all the interesting issues about lateralization of emotion and Richie Davidson's work and all these kinds of issues. And one classic paper that Eddie Harmon-Jones did about anger, whether that's left or right hemisphere. It turns out it's left hemisphere as a kind of approach or dominant task representation. So that also maps onto approach versus avoid. So there's a whole another talk on that thing. One interesting consequence of a goal representation is that they have to have a positive outcome. Okay? So even when you're faced with an aversive situation, you have to have a positive outcome that you're seeking. It just doesn't make any sense to think about having a negative outcome as an object of a goal representation. And so it's a way of kind of thinking about the organization of positive and negative affect, that negative stimuli are not really directly tied to the goal representations in the same way that positive ones are. And that when you have a negative situation, your goal becomes to avoid or escape the negative situation. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff about kind of the polarity of these, the valence of affect and things like that. And then one of the really interesting applications of these ideas is to think about the clinical disorders. So for example, in depression, the story from this framework is that this is a vicious cycle that says you have a kind of overall negative affect for some reason, leads to an inability to get any of the goal representations over threshold to be selected, which then leads to this kind of negative affect associated with the inability to select goals. It's aversive to be in a situation where you can't engage a current goal representation. And that's essentially a kind of helplessness situation that ties into the learned helplessness literature. And you get in this vicious cycle that negative affect about the inability to select goals, perpetuates this negative cycle. And therapies that involve breaking down, again, big problems into small problems and getting people to gain control over their negative affect and the situations that are causing that are really effective therapies in breaking that vicious cycle. And this would be very consistent with this framework. OCD is a really interesting case because it's about avoiding things like what Liz was talking about, things you can't see, things you don't know whether you've succeeded, right? So how do I know if I've succeeded in avoiding an infection? I just don't know, and so I better wash my hands again. And so avoidance goals are a really particularly interesting case where you don't really know when you've succeeded in avoiding a negative outcome. And so, yeah, there's some interesting potential insight into that. One interesting idea is that ADHD is not a primary deficit in executive function, which is a kind of popular theory, but rather it's about having a really overactive right hemisphere alternative goal system that's constantly saying, hey, I could do something else. So instead of having such a strong dominant left kind of goal engaged mode, you're more likely to kind of be balancing between considering alternative goal representations. And one really interesting fact about ADHD is that it's much more prevalent in people who are left-handed, and in particular people who are ambiguous-handed. And so potentially has a connection with this laterality stuff. And then PTSD is often associated with depression. And again, it's this problem of inability to overcome a negative stimulus that you can't, you activate this goal representation, but you can't overcome it. That you can't wipe out that memory. And so then that leads into this helplessness kind of phenomenon. So finally, there's a lot of research looking at default mode cognition. And in my mind, this default mode, which really activates all those same areas that I was talking about on the medial surface, I guess this is the medial surface here, of prefrontal cortex, is really all about thinking about what am I going to do next. Okay? And that people spend a huge amount of their lives, basically, whenever you don't tell somebody to do something else, they're sitting there ruminating, you probably doing it right now, about what am I going to do next? What do I have to do later? What's my plans? I wonder if I could do this. Oh, last time I did that, it was didn't turn out so well. All that kind of juggling and rumination about self-relevant, affectively relevant kind of states, so that when you are able to engage a goal, you've sort of worked through a lot of the costs and benefits in advance. And we seem to spend a lot of our time doing that. Okay, so now I just want to get to this computational model and show you how all those ideas kind of work in practice. Okay, so here's our model. Oh, darn. Gotta get that over there. Where we have basically a network having a perceptual system looking at a world, representing kind of objects in that world, also spatial locations, which are kind of very summarily represented as associated with the hippocampus, not very accurately. And then you have this core ACC, OFC value representations here that I was talking about, mapping out positive and negative valued outcomes for consideration for selecting the next goal. Down here you have the lateral hypothalamus, basolateral amygdala, and here's your dopamine nuclei. And up here is the kind of motor control system. And the basic phenomenology of this model is to very, very, very simple model, to have a little rat, we call him Emery, because it lives in emergent. If it's a human robot guy that we simulate, we call him Emer, but this our rat guy we call Emery just because it's cuter. And so Emery just kind of runs around and looks at these different stimuli through his sort of very simple visual system, and has different random bodily states imposed upon the rat. And basically we're saying, oh, you know, you're both hungry and deficient in vegetables, okay? Deficient in so we have, it's more specific. So you're deficient in protein and in vegetables, or you're thirsty and you're deficient in vegetables, etc. And then each one of these different outcomes provides, like this is the veggie one, this is provide a meat pellet, this is a sugar pellet, and this is a little water tablet, okay? Very classic kind of animat type of models where you have different bodily states that need to be satisfied. And what's essentially happening is once one of those goals is satisfied, Emery is sort of sitting here at the start thinking about essentially what do I want to do next, okay? And so we have free will in our little rat. And when you see that little kind of twisting motion, yeah, you can kind of see it there. It's a random initial orientation, and you can see a little turn. That's the rat kind of looking at each of the different stimuli and deciding which one fits with my engaged goal. And in fact, the way the rat is looking at the start provides some bias for the goal that's selected, but it's not necessarily the dominant one. And what's really interesting, I think, about this is thinking about that constraint satisfaction process that's weighing all the different factors, including the visual stimuli, but also the other state variables. So if we go in here and kind of just look in detail at this information processing that takes place as a particular start of a goal selection process. The rat is sitting there, and it's in the middle of the maze. It's already satisfied one of its previous goals. And right now, coming into it is a negative body state that says, I need liquid and I need vitamins. Vitamins is what we need when we get vegetables, okay? In this very simplified world. And this is going to go up as a kind of lateral hypothalamus type representation and drive consideration of affective states, primary value outcomes, that would satisfy those negative bodily states, okay? And so here we have getting liquid and getting vitamins activated in the OFC. And if we zoom in on that, we can see initially both states are equally active. And so the rat is kind of considering both of these alternatives equally strongly. And what's interesting is when the constraint satisfaction process kicks in, and through prior learning, all the representations in the system, except for these core mappings from the subcortex to the OFC, according to that map, are learned. So there's a learned association between these primary values and these ACC action plans that in this very simplified world are like approach the blue thing or approach the green thing. And it kind of activates those possible action plans. And now those action plans have been associated with other possible outcomes. And in this case, it could be things like effort or possibility of getting killed or shocked or whatever. In this very simple case, what we've done is just said that if you consider approaching the green thing, you'll experience with some probability a bitter taste associated with those vegetables. And so that bitter representation that's starting to get active here is interconnected mutually with the green action plan, and it's providing essentially a negative feedback signal that says, oh, if you're going to do that, you might experience this negative outcome, whereas the water kind of liquid approach thing doesn't really have too many negative outcomes associated with it. And as that constraint satisfaction works through, the positive kind of utilities again versus the negative utilities weigh out, and you end up selecting the appropriate action. And you can see this as a graph over time. Both alternatives are kind of equally activated, but then in the ACC kind of action value representation, the green guy really starts to drop off when you consider this negative bitter outcome as a potential outcome of that green action plan. And that leads the blue, kind of approach blue, to win out. And then as that finally settles, those representations get locked into the system here, into the orbital and ACC distributed representation of the goal, including this DLPFC plan representation, which actually drives a sequence of actions to approach that. And it really just does a very simple process of comparing the visual input that's currently coming in with the target representation that was previously associated with this action plan, the blue stimulus representation. And if it matches, it goes and approaches that. And if it doesn't match, then it kind of spins around until it does. And so now we see the rat basically approaching the goal. So all of this is really just a simplified way of kind of capturing the interplay of these different brain areas and this two stages of cognition between action selection and, goal selection and goal engaged. And now, as the rat is approaching that particular target, you get these incremental dopamine bursts. It turns out the PPTG and the VTA in this case are overlapping except here at the end. So this red line is really the dopamine bursts as your LV representation of approaching the positive stimuli associated with the currently engaged goal goes up. You get these kind of temporal derivative dopamine bursts. And so that's the incremental progress as the rat is approaching, driving further activation towards that goal accomplishment. So it really has all the different pieces I talked about. And again, this is really at the start of this. So there's a lot more to explore in this model, but that gives you at least a little sense of where we're going with that. And I guess I'm running a little bit low on time here, so I'm just going to sort of skip over some of this stuff. I think there's some really important computational advantages to do goal selection first and then figure out what the values are relative to a current goal instead of doing kind of constant look ahead to, I guess this is this point, partitioning the problem. If you partition it into knowing what you want and recognizing progress, that's a much easier problem than trying to solve both of those at the same time. Existing models that talk about goal-driven cognition tend to, again, try to compute the goals on the fly with this kind of exponential look-ahead problem. Whereas if you do the goal selection in advance and then have the goal in mind, it makes it much easier to solve that overall problem of figuring out what you want to do in the world. So just to summarize, there's these two distinct states of motivated behavior, goal selection and goal engaged. I think it provides a reasonable partitioning of the computational problem and consistent with the overall biology of the brain involved in these dopamine and affective limbic areas. Again, the online textbook that you can go to for free and just read about all the kind of components of these models that I presented. And thanks to all the folks in my lab and collaborators and funding. And thanks to you. Questions? Yeah.
Can you use your model to depress Emery?
Yeah, right, yeah.
And if you can depress Emery,
Yeah.
distinguish depressing him from getting him bored.
Right. Good question. Right. So what's the difference between boredom and depression in that context?
Well,
Yeah.
so if I'm stuck in goal selection phase in both instances,
Yep.
that would be one of the ways in which I
Yeah.
You had that taxonomy
Yeah.
that boredom might arise from
Yeah.
reactivation. But
Yeah.
it might arise also from the same sense of being stuck in goal
Exactly.
selection. And what drives me in one instance
Yeah.
to be depressed and in another to be bored.
So I think the standard answer in the field would be that the anhedonia of depression, the lack of positive affect or the predominance of negative affect, is what makes you unable to select goals when you're depressed. Whereas when you're bored, the inability to select goals is due to the lack of opportunities. So you are sitting in an airplane and you can't use your little device and you just have to sit there. So that you're not actually sad, you don't have a negative affect, but you do have the negative affect associated with the inability to select something to do. So there's some amount of overlap, but I think the reason why you can't select a goal in one case is that nothing gets into the positive territory relative to the negative affect. In one case versus the other case being you're essentially frustrated. You can't, there's no opportunity for selecting something that you want to do.
Sure, but
Yeah.
would the model differentiate between those?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we wanted to induce depression in Emery, we would just crank up. We could actually do it, I don't know if I can do it on the fly, but wouldn't that be impressive? But in principle, you could just crank up the activity of neurons in this layer right here, which is the negative kind of affective representation. And that would cause the system to overweight the negatives of everything, and nothing would get above the positive threshold, and you'd just be stuck, basically. So it would be a different etiology. Whereas in the boredom case, you would just have no it's not really well represented here, but you would have no possibility of achieving any of the things that match your kind of current drive state. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on what's going on when you forget your goal or lose track of what you're doing, what accounts for that sort of thing.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like, everybody has that experience, right? When you walk into the kitchen and you knew you were going to do something, but it's like, why am I here? So is that losing the goal or is it losing the plan? I guess it's probably both, right? I haven't really thought about that in that context exactly. I mean, we talk about that all the time in terms of working memory, and you can get interrupted in working memory representations and lose that. But if goal representations really are the same as working memory in limbic, regions of frontal cortex, which is basically what we're saying, then yeah, it should be equivalent to that. That goes back to this other question about, maybe there's some synaptic changes there that give you a little more permanence, because it seems a little fragile. But I guess objectively, it does seem like some goals you can forget about, some goals you can't, and what's the difference? Yeah, I don't know. That's a really interesting question.
You don't forget the utility because you walk into the kitchen and say, I know I came in here for something.
Right, well, you have some, you know there's an intentionality, but you don't know what.
Intentionality and goal.
But if you knew the outcome you were seeking.
You don't know what the goal is.
Yeah.
So it gives you a clue that
Yeah.
there's something separate about the goalness of something.
Right.
Versus what you're attributing the goal, the motivation. Let's turn it on. Let's not say the goal, but the motivation,
Yeah.
the incentive
Yeah.
you have to act.
You have that.
Not forget.
Right. You knew you were doing something.
But the specifics of what it is, so it means it's a separate concept.
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting. I mean, I think you could lose each part of those different things. Like you may have a sense that you are going to do something difficult, but you forgot what in particular. So you may have a sense of some of the different values there that you lose some of them, but you get the other one. So that would be a good mirror, window onto kind of, the different components of the system if you could interrupt them specifically. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And that's consistent with the model that it's really a distributed representation that's linking all these things. I guess we had over here, yeah.
What constitutes being in a formulation of So when I start a goal, I can stop it. Right now I have a folder which has the name of that paper in, but it's been over a month, I don't go back to it.
Yeah.
I just don't. Or people go to grad school and they opt out halfway through.
Yeah.
What constitutes that you are in the goal engaged moment?
Right. And, you know, yeah. So first of all, there is a sense in which there's multiple goals that can be engaged, right? And there's different timescales of those. And
when you say it's robust, hard, do you give up?
yeah.
What does it refer to?
Well, don't you think? I mean, I have this experience with most of the people who probably shouldn't be in grad school, that it takes them quite a while to realize that and to give up on the goal. And, you know, well beyond the available signals of a rational a rational person that's saying this probably isn't the best thing for you to be doing with your life. But so I think, you know, that's an indication, and that we have that ability. You know, if you tell somebody no, you can't do what you wanted to do, you get a lot of pushback. You know, I mean, you get the adult version of a tantrum at some point. So.
Still, we can't say there is a certain.
But if you say you're going to give up on your goal, then really what you've done, I think, is you've selected another goal, okay, that you thought was better. And you've decided, you know, agentically as yourself that, you know, you went through a different goal selection process and you said, now I have a new goal.
So there's no like order from after which you are in the goal engaged mode.
No, but then you have a new goal engaged, right? And so you're, you know, that's the idea, is you don't just kind of sit around without goals engaged. You've always got something engaged. And you probably, again, going back to this multiple timescales, you have things at different timescales and that are contextualizing things. And probably you'll have like one immediate goal that's the kind of really active goal, and then you have these other broader contextualizing goals. And, you know, working out exactly how that all works is kind of complicated. But yeah, so that's the general model. But that if you decide to give up on something, and there's actually some really nice work from Carver and Shire and those folks, looking at the adaptive consequences of people who can give up on their goals. And they did these studies where they basically said, you know, looking at the kind of mental health outcomes associated with people who could easily give up on goals versus not. And surprisingly, those who could give up on goals were actually better, even though we think that, you know, being able to persevere or perseverate, as the case may be, is an important, you know, behavioral personality characteristics. Anyway, there's a lot of interesting issues there. Yeah.
How do you see habitual behaviors fit into this? Like it seems
right.
like a different case than selecting.
Yeah.
Somehow you plan to do one thing and you suddenly end up at work anyway or something.
Right.
You selected, to work as a new goal. It was somehow
right.
something different.
Yeah, and so there's that interplay of the you know, of the top-down kind of frontal cortex kind of goal representation states versus the kind of bottom-up, you know, stimulus-driven habituals type stuff. And you know, I think it's interesting that our brains do learn habits. That saves us, I think, the ability to sit there and ruminate about all the important things that you want to do at a different time scale, so that you can, you know, it essentially frees your mind to do default mode behavior and think about what else you want to be doing, or planning other level goals. And so, yeah, so that's what habits are good for. And typically, when you find yourself doing that is when you've kind of been daydreaming about other possible goal states or other things, and therefore you haven't been really driving your current engaged goal very well. Yeah, yeah, right, exactly. So I think that actually plays into that, yeah. Yeah.
What I find fascinating about this model, we were talking about this before, this is a wonderful talk, is it brings out that there's a risk associated with the model, in that when you choose a goal, that's sort of foregone other goals and opportunities.
Right.
And it also looks like, thinking about this in terms of an arms race between predator and prey, as if it makes you more predictable. And that makes me think that there should be a system which starts with this as the oversimplification and then can self-monitor to some degree and modulate the system to tune away from settings of the system that would be particularly vulnerable. Have you thought about that?
Oh, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, you know, I mean, one related, possibly related thing that plays into that is, you know, like, why do we have these different cognitive profiles like ADHD, for example, that persist in the population? And one idea is that, you know, there's advantages to people who really focus for a long period of time on one thing obsessively, but there's also consequences to that. There's cost to that. And so there's advantages for people who can easily switch among multiple alternative different goals. And, you know, one thing that I've talked about with people before is like management versus, people are good at managing people or managing, you know, overall organizations versus people who are kind of good at, you know, sitting down and doing a particular task. That management level thing tends to be more of a kind of constant switching among different possible things, never engaging too deeply with any one of them. And so that may suit a particular kind of personality characteristic. The predator-prey thing, you know, would go back to obviously a further context, more ancient evolutionary past, but I think it's perhaps similar kinds of things, right? And probably if you look at rats, for example, you know, the impression is that they're, you know, they make these little jumpy moves, and that they're constantly, once they do some little bit of action, they're constantly reevaluating, right, and deciding if they're going to keep doing or doing something else. And that kind of constant onlineness of that cognition is probably really evolutionary advantageous, because if they got really obsessed, I'm going to get that piece of cheese over there, and I don't care if there's this, you know, predator just about to eat me, you know, that obviously would be deleterious. So you can imagine that, in fact, our ability to sustain that really strong goal focus over long periods of time is really not very evolutionary adaptive in that context, right? Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
So maybe I'm going to suggest that we adjourn at this point, so those of you will have a chance to get some lunch, and we'll be back for the next talk at 1:15. And so thank you once again.